This is Chapter 3, Section 1, Community Ecology. Here we go. All living organisms are limited by factors in the environment. The EQs, will answer those at the end. Vocab that we'll cover. Here we go. Community. Community is a review term. We've had this before in our levels of organization when we first started ecology. We know that a population is a group of individuals that belong to the same species living in the same place at the same time. So community is expanding that out to all the populations. So basically every living thing that lives together in the same place at the same time is part of the community. Limiting factors. Any factor that restricts the number, reproduction, or redistribution, it just means movement, of organisms is called a limiting factor. And that means it's limiting the size that population can grow to, basically. Abiotic examples, abiotic, non-living, limiting factors are sunlight, climate, temperature, water, nutrients, fire, soil chemistry, space, and others. There could be more than that. That's a not terribly long list. There's more. There's lots of them we could think of. Biotic limiting factors, living limiting factors include other plant and animal species. I would also add to this bacteria, like bacterial infections could limit a community. Also fungal infections would be limiting factors as well. Any living thing could be a biotic limiting factor. All right, range of tolerance. For any environmental condition, there's an upper limit and a lower limit an organism can survive. So in this graph, it's showing us steelhead trout, and it's talking about the temperature of the water, and that there's a certain temperature that above which these things cannot survive, and that's their upper limit, and beyond that temperature is called a zone of intolerance. They can't tolerate that temperature. And on the other end, on the lower limit, the same idea. There's a certain temperature. Any lower than that, they cannot survive. That's also zone of intolerance. They cannot tolerate temperatures that low. In the middle, there's this optimum zone. That's where they are the best. They survive and thrive most successfully at a certain range. And then outside of that range, they can live, but they experience stress. So this here is like the zone of physiological stress. That means their body doesn't physiologically function as well as it could if the temperature in this case were cooler, and then on this side if the temperature were warmer. So they tolerate it, but they are stressed. And it says their steelhead trout are infrequent, and then in the middle is that optimum zone where they do their best. So the ability of any organism to survive when subjected to abiotic or biotic factors is called tolerance. So the range of tolerance is where they are present on the low end all the way through the high end of temperature. And that's just one condition. This graph could be used for all sorts of different conditions we just talked about. Ecological succession is the change that happens in a community or an ecosystem over time. They're constantly changing, and when the abiotic and biotic factors change, sometimes dramatically, then it can really change the species that are present in that community or in that ecosystem. And there's two types of succession, primary and secondary. In primary succession, this happens in an area where there is no soil. No soil, so it's a clean slate, and then there's predictable steps that happen. That's what succession is. It's this predictable, we've learned over the years, these steps that occur. So like in this example here, it starts with bare rock. Bare rock is going to come from things like when lava cools, that becomes bare rock. When a glacier moves and it exposes bare rock. Anywhere that there's no soil, there's bare rock. The first species that come along are called pioneer species. The pioneers, they are the first ones to settle the bare rock. Things like lichens, things like mosses, and they lay down the foundation of what will become the soil in that area. And then over time, you can see the steps. It's very predictable. Lichens, mosses, small annual plants, perennial herbs and grasses. All of these are small herbaceous plants. And then somewhere in this intermediate stage, shrubs become present. Those are the woody stemmed plant species. Shade intolerant trees. And then toward the end, shade tolerant trees. And that's when we get to a mature community or a climax community. That's our vocab term. That's when it's changed and it's gone through all the steps of succession and it's stable now and it's balanced. Secondary succession occurs when soil is present. So it's going to be much, much faster because it takes a long time for lichens and mosses to settle and to form the soil. So this is going to be after something like a wildfire or clear cutting, things of that nature that remove all the vegetation but leave the soil behind. And we see a similar sequence of events where instead of starting out with lichens, since there's already soil, we can go straight to things like annual plants and grasses, shrubs. Pines come first. Pines are usually first trees on the scene, and then later hardwoods like oaks and hickories form. And this is for our the United States, this temperate forest biome that we're familiar with. That's secondary succession. All right, so EQs, here we go. How do unfavorable abiotic and biotic factors affect species? We know that for all species, there are a range of tolerance that we just saw, and a zone of intolerance is beyond that range. And for all these different abiotic factors, things like water and temperature, and then for biotic factors, things like other plants and animals and bacteria, those can limit the number of individuals, so the size of the population, the reproductive rates of the population, and the distribution, how things can move around. The ranges of tolerance affect the distribution of organisms. I mentioned that already, that there's some optimal zone for any of these conditions where organisms do the best. And then outside of that zone, there's zones of physiological stress and then zones of intolerance where they can't exist. So those are the ranges that we talked about there. Stages of primary and secondary succession. Primary succession, there's no soil present, so there has to be soil formed. So the pioneer species come in, the lichens, the mosses, and they become, over time, the soil that the annual plants can grow into, eventually shrubs, and then pines, and then finally hardwoods. Secondary succession is after something like a brush fire. There's soil already there, so it occurs faster. We don't need the lichens and mosses to form the soil. The annual plants can immediately start succeeding in that area. So that's it for section 1. Go Knights. Have a good day.